Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of the Race Sim Central podcast, where old gits sit and talk about Sims. I'm John Denton, and today with me I have Simon Croft and RSC Big Chief Tim Wheatley. Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Good. How about you?
Yeah, and we've managed to get together once again after only this time, I think, 4 months.
It's a
So,
record.
yeah, it's a really good effort from us, isn't it, to really keep our monthly podcast going. And Simon, how are you doing?
I'm okay, thanks. I'm on the mend after a period of getting old and ill, but yeah, back with my usual enthusiasm and joie de vie. So
Your verve for life, yes.
yeah,
Okay. We're into a special edition today because we're not going to talk about conventional racing sims where you all sit and drive the car around. We're going to talk about management sims, and specifically those that are focused on motorsport, not Planet Coaster. So, right, this subject came up in my mind, Tim, because you've obviously been, and this is a shameless plug, been putting up some of these games onto Race Sim Central to be playable in a browser, especially some of the older stuff. And over the last few months, I've played a number of these games. After essentially starting with Frontier's release from last year, which Formula One Manager 23. Frontier obviously picked up the F1 license a few years back, and so their first product was F1 Manager 22. They've done 23. We've got 24 coming this year in
Yeah.
August, I believe. I went on a mission of discovery to play some of these older games, really, if anything, to find out how these modern games of Frontiers really hold up. One of the first things that struck me on the whole is that the Frontier games focus very much on the race management experience. And it could be argued, I think, that they don't focus so much on essentially the management side of the game. Now, every single F1 manager, and I'm going to say F1 manager because nearly all motorsport management games are F1 focused. Though later on we can come on to some of those that aren't, and indeed why they're all focused that way. I think that a balance has to be struck because all of these games have the race part and the management part back at base, sort of thing, and that any of these they have to manage how they focus the gameplay in either direction. What's your take, both of you, on what you think the player base, or rather, what you think a game developer should be focusing on, particularly in this area?
Well, I do think the way that they have the race, the like things set up right now, it is you are correct. It is set up where it looks like and it feels like the focus of the game is very much on the race experience. And yeah, people are going to spend a lot of time in those races, especially if they don't accelerate the time too much, they're going to spend a lot of time there. And the games tend to be best played that way, where you experience the full race and you can fully understand the story of what's happening and stuff like that. So I understand why they're putting a lot of time into it, but it does feel like it's not balanced right now. I don't think there's an awful lot of gameplay outside of that. It's kind of not visual at all outside of the race experience, if you get what I mean. You have
Yeah,
like a background image basically. You don't see kind of buildings going up and stuff like
yeah.
that in the same visual way that you would expect looking at the race experience.
I
I'm
mean, I think to be fair to Frontier, well, I mean, I think we're always going to be fair, but the race experience that they put together is superb. I
Mhm.
think like in terms of presentation, anyway.
Yeah.
The gameplay aspects necessarily of it are I don't know, they're almost become a bit of a standard in these types of games. I think you manage how much the driver is pushing, or you might manage their ERS deployment and things like that, which I think is in common with a lot of other online games like IGP Manager and so on, and Motorsport Manager as well. But there's a question that I see raised quite often, which is, in the game, in the management section, for instance, you pay to hire top quality race engineers for your drivers. And yet, when you go into the race,
you're
you seem to be the one doing their job,
Yeah.
which seems an odd disparity.
I think with something like this, different people will go in wanting different things ideally, like will have a personal slant on where they would like the focus to be, but it's completely understandable why the energy has gone onto that kind of race side. I think that's the safe bet for what most people, at the very least, are going to want included, if not be the sole focus of it. I don't think anyone's probably wanting to join this so they can manage the catering budget without having an interest in what happens on the pit wall, for example, but you can very much imagine vice versa. I've not delved into these anything like you have, but when you talk about kind of making these hirings and then not actually seemingly see any sort of benefit from that, does that mean that actually functionally within the game they're pointless, or it's basically a box ticking exercise, but you still then ultimately have to do their job, or what?
But this is the funny thing, because I've not really experimented at length with that, i.e. if you hire the cheapest possible race engineer, does anything different happen? And it probably does, I'm sure. But
they've probably weighted something.
Yeah. But and I think, for instance, during practice sessions, your drivers gain a certain amount of progress and set up comfort and things like that, which I imagine is probably tied into that staff member. But this is another aspect that makes the game very difficult to do this sort of trial and error with. Nowadays, the F1 season is 24 races, right? The 23 season was 23 races, and that means that if you work through every single race, now you can do every single practice session and every single qualifying session in real time as well. But if you just do the races, that's 2 hours per race. So you're having to do a very significant amount of hours to complete just one season.
Yep.
Now I think these games, because they're a yearly release from Frontier, and that's obviously that's going to be part of the contract that they have with Formula One, I'm sure. Because they're yearly releases, I feel like the game is really focused on doing that one season. And I think you can do 10 seasons or something. So obviously, if you keep going, things get significantly more and more out of kilter with what's going on in modern Formula One. And I'm sure that the contract or the licensing deal would have been very difficult to strike in many ways with Formula One, because like Mercedes don't want, ironically, an image of Lewis Hamilton driving a Ferrari, right? And Max Verstappen in a Mercedes or whatever, because obviously once you go through multiple seasons, drivers are going to move around teams, and that goes against kind of the marketing ethos of what Formula One pushing this game out to do. And I think that's very much why, for instance, there is, in the management simulation, there's no management of sponsors on the cars, which, if you look in the past, and the Grand Prix Manager, Grand Prix World, the Microprose games from the 1990s, that was a very big part of those games. Grand Prix World in particular had a very complex and interesting system where you schmooze different sponsors at different races, and if you can work that sort of mini game quite well to get more and more budget coming into your team, and that actually made the management side of, I think, Grand Prix World much more interesting.
Yeah. Was that grounded in the kind of then present reality, or was it a complete fantasy thing? Sorry.
It was based around the 1999 Formula One season to start with, and you ran for 10 seasons in Grand Prix World.
So real teams, real sponsors.
Precisely. If you were with McLaren, you were sponsored by West. I think in the game there was a mod to patch in the actual cigarette names, but it was something else. And then like non cigarette advertisers were the real names. And then you could steal West from McLaren when you if you were playing as Tyrrell, for instance, and get a big money sponsor into your team and that sort of thing. Um, it's I feel like as a in looking at the Frontier games comparatively, they've taken away that whole chunk, which is obviously going to be around a licensing scenario where you can't have a Red Bull with you know Google written down the side of it, or Monster written down the side of it.
Yeah, this
Um,
that was actually broke ground a little bit by Codemasters, because the F1 games for a little while, when you do the kind of my team mode and multiple seasons and stuff, the drivers do actually change teams, but
yeah,
they keep like their race suits and their helmet. And the sponsors are all fake.
right.
So it is basically the same licensing deal as F1 Manager appears to have.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And it puts a restriction on these games in a way, doesn't it? Like there was a great bunch of articles on Race Department, well, Overtake.gg now, that were sort of charting the history of F1 management games, and they mentioned that like in the '90s, the licensing terms that people had with Formula One in video games were far more wide open. Like nobody in the Formula One side had really given it that much thought, and so as a result, they were just like, "Yeah, do what you like," And we saw this with Jeff Crammon's games and stuff as well. Like it was a bit more free to be able to do things. Whereas now, I think they'll push back on modding. They'll push back on the idea that the cars and the drivers don't look how they're supposed to look for this current season and things like that. And it puts a big restriction on this type of game, really, doesn't it? It's a big problem for Frontier, I feel, because certainly that money, bringing in money to the team aspect, if you think about a simulation of what a team principal does in real life, it isn't, they don't manage the cars in the race directly necessarily. Maybe you'll come on the radio occasionally and tell the driver to shut up or whatever, but you also don't design the car. You consult with the people who do design the car, and you might be asked to make certain decisions on direction potentially, but you would mostly be giving that to your technical director to deal with.
Yeah.
So what would a management sim of a team principal actually really be?
You need Adrian Newey simulator, don't you? Really, if you want to have a bit of spread, but
Well, I mean, interestingly, the German-made game F1 Manager Pro in '96, I think it was.
Yep, 96.
That had you designed the parts like manually. It had a like sort of built-in CAD designer, and obviously you could build some terrible abomination that wouldn't work, and or something very quick. I mean, obviously that's an interesting one because it obviously didn't have a real-time CFD simulation going on, but it did. I think people eventually sort of worked out what the game considered was a good design and things like that you could sort of game the system.
Yeah, it's the same with anything really. Like I think even back to, like, I used to play Premier Manager on the Amiga, even though I've never been a footy fan or anything like that. Like I used to play that anyway because the gameplay was really compelling. But it was it definitely wasn't the actual games that were compelling. It was what was going on outside of that, and the amount of detail that you kind of had to get into, and the stuff that you had to sort out and everything.
So dealing with tough decisions and things like that.
Yeah, and it just I feel like that's a little bit lost. There's kind of minimal consequence to kind of everything that you do with the current F1 Manager game, in a way, because it's generally easy to generate money, and then once you've got money, it's generally easy to eventually get a good car. It kind of doesn't matter what team you start with. By the second or third season, you're there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think you've seen a lot of people winning with Williams in the second season and
yeah,
stuff.
that
Yeah.
just doesn't ever feel correct. If you look at the real world, obviously it's not correct.
But
Yeah,
then, arguably, if it was accurate, then you could probably do 10 seasons with Williams and barely scratch the points, right?
Yeah, exactly. But why not have difficulty options that are kind of
Yeah.
realistic, and then give someone the option to actually struggle through an entire career as an F1 manager?
But we've spoken before though, Tim, especially you, about like in traditional simulations, doing a season with like one of the lower teams and cars, and you're not there racing to the front every race. The whole point is you're struggling to come
Hmm.
third from last rather than last. And
Yeah.
if you're taking on Williams, say, no, the idea isn't you win the championship in your second year, but the idea is that maybe by your third year or something, you've got them up to like fifth in the constructors or
Yeah.
something, which in the real world would be a huge achievement. And if you want to just win, well then fine, you take on Red Bull or whatever, and do it that way. Is
Yeah.
it? You mentioned about money though, but is there no in these frontier games? Is there like cost cap in place
The
with
cost cap,
with
one
the
of,
real exceptions of like your top five
yeah,
employees or whatever and stuff?
yeah, it's one of the more interesting aspects is that the cost cap restrictions that you have in place, which go in line with the, I can't remember what they call it, but it's the restrictions on wind tunnel time
Mm.
based on um, how much, how well you did in the previous year and stuff like that. Um, I must admit, it's been quite interesting how that's allowed me to learn more about how that actually works in real life through the game,
Mm.
because I didn't realize how it works with how they have different windows of, like, in a given, I think it's a 6 week period. This is how much wind tunnel time you have, and in the subsequent 6 week period, you might have a different amount of allocation and things like that. And I think that's quite interesting. There's obviously also stuff in modern F1, in terms of restrictions on parts, where you've got a certain amount of management in the car. Like in these older games, in Grand Prix World, if I played, I played initially as Ferrari, right, with the richest team, to essentially just to get to grips with the game. And you put in a new. You stick a new engine in both cars every single race, potentially more often than that, and you build new parts all of the time, and you're constantly upgrading the car. And then like once I'd sussed out how the game works, I went to do a bottom end team, and obviously then you're incredibly restricted purely by money that you've got available to use, and manpower and resource, because the amount of money and the amount of staff that you can hire restricts the amount you can actually do in between races. um, in modern F1, you have things like you've got to make an engine and power unit and gearbox. You're supposed to do the whole season on 3 gearboxes, right? You're supposed to do
Right.
the whole season on 3 races. And as we see in real F1, most teams don't manage that, and they end up taking penalties later in the season for replacing parts and stuff like that. So, and managing that stuff, like I started a playthrough as Red Bull, again, to get to grips with the game from a perspective of being strong. Admittedly, the first thing I did was sack Perez and hire Fernando Alonso into the second car, which I thought would be something to make it much more interesting for me, which it was in a way, but it has, well, put it this way, I lost. I've won every race this season other than one, and that was the first race of the season, and it was because those two dicks took each other off. But yeah, I mean, they both finished the race. I think they finished fourth and sixth or something. But Verstappen put a move onto Alonso, and shoved like them both off the road, and they both went wide and into the dirt for a bit, and then came back on, etc. Anyway,
Sounds pretty accurate.
I was
That's
going to say,
yeah,
some
yeah,
realism in there.
well, I mean, since then I've been doing a lot more with regards to don't fight teammate option. But yeah, so I mean, essentially, I didn't sort of twig that to start with, and so one thing that you do, for instance, is swap out older parts to run practice sessions and stuff like that. You run it. Oh, we're going to run an old engine for Friday because obviously you want the freshest possible engine for race day, whatever. And that to start with in the early races, obviously you start with something fresh, and that's okay. But then it starts to, as the races go on, that starts to become quite a juggling act. What I'm actually sad about is that they haven't that isn't 100% realistic. For instance, the in real life, the MGU component restrictions are broken down into MGUK replacement, the energy store. You can only
Oh,
have two energy stores, two control electronics, three control electronics, I think. The MGUK and MGUH components, and exhausts as well. You can only have 7 exhausts per year, and you get certain penalties based on that. And what they've done is basically go engine, gearbox, MGU components all in one block. So you manage all of those things. I
I
think
had not thought about that.
there would be more
Hmm.
management available if you were like if they actually applied the real life rules to this, whereby you're juggling more components instead of just like those three as a block. Um,
I was actually thinking. I wonder if a lot of the issues with the modern F1 manager are the issues with modern F1. Like you were saying earlier about the number of races and stuff like that. I mean, I think there's too many races in F1 right now, and it's. I think the gameplay might actually be more compelling if there was less races. To kind of reverse direction on a problem car, and kind of those kind of things. Although you did have testing back then, but then at the same time. I think one of the biggest issues that real F1 has right now is the reliability. In that you can basically go an entire season and obviously never have any retirements and stuff. And
yeah.
those sims from the 90s, they show it how it really was. You were lucky if there was 8 cars
Oh
that
yeah, yeah.
would kind of finish a race, and
If
and
you
um, that's
If you play
that's
as a back of the field team in Grand Prix World, like you might not finish a race for half of the season.
right. Yeah, it's I
but
that feels way more real. You know.
But the thing is as well, you look at modern F1 for the last few years, and I don't just mean to be an old sort of rose tinted specs type person, but like it's certainly in the context we're talking about here. If you think about how predictable on large it is and how processional and everything else, well, a realistic management sim isn't going to suddenly like, oh,
Be interesting.
you've taken over Williams. They're
Yeah.
fighting for the championship now because you're so
Yeah.
much better than these people in real life. Like if it's at all realistic, you're not gonna do any better. I mean, you could obviously deliberately sabotage things and do badly in a team, but I mean, you're not going to just magically take a team up, and that's arguably not what it should be about, as we were saying with the case of, say, Williams. But then it's almost like, well, what's the point of this then? You basically pick the real world team you like and you finish where they finish in reality, and
Yeah.
what, just endure on a race by race basis or something. But
I
also
mean,
the 24 races thing, and I'm not sort of talking about being particularly kind of fickle here, but you could imagine you're 12 races into a season and you're like, where's this going? Like, have I kind of made some bad decisions or not and stuff? It's like, with a season that long, you're kind of a bit locked into either let's grind it out and see where it finishes and perhaps have quite an unsatisfying experience, or it's like, right, I'm 12 races in, which could be nearly a whole season if you were talking like,
it's
years gone by. And then it's
probably
like,
60 hours gameplay.
yeah, and then it's like, actually, nah, I want to restart. And I can see it being quite a sort of motivation killer either way, potentially.
I do find actually that with the modern titles, I feel like I've restarted a lot because I'm like, oh, I didn't start my season correctly because I'm only intending to play 1 or 2 seasons.
Mm.
And I feel like with the older ones, I would be like, kind of so many seasons deep, and it was about the long haul effort.
Well, the thing with Grand Prix World, for instance, and GP Manager 1 and 2 before it, is that you could essentially auto resolve. Not, like it can play out and simulate the race without you having to be there. And you don't have to be there constantly saying push now and stop now, or pit stop now. You set the pit stop strategy before the race, sure. And then off you go. And so as a result, like I think in about 20 hours play of Grand Prix World, I completed 4 full seasons. Whereas in 20 hours play in F1 Manager 23, I probably completed about 4 or 5 races.
Mm.
Um, and I think if the race part is really what you're into, then that's great. But as Simon says, like this is F1. There will be races that are boring. I
Hmm.
mean, and like I've done races as Red Bull where I'm winning 1-2, and it's boring.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's quite nice to see your guys out at the front and everything, but then you're like, well, it's lap 27 of 53, and I know where this is going.
Yeah.
Um, and like realistically, I don't have much more input to do at this point. Now, then you'll have different races where rain comes and things like that are going to be a lot more interesting. Stuff's going to happen, safety car, etc. Like that sort of thing is what keeps the real sport interesting, and that's how it works in the sim as well.
Well, yeah, I always feel like people get the wrong impression of F1 almost is that I mean a football game that's 1-0, that's not necessarily a boring game because it's been 90 minutes of anticipation, and I feel that F1 has historically been the same thing. You would it could quite easily be the most boring thing ever, and then some guy does this thing that you've been trying and hoping would happen for the entire race, and he actually does it or tries to do it or whatever. And I've used this example multiple times, but the most exciting F1 race I can ever remember as a kid was Mansell not passing Senna at Monaco. That's a boring result. He didn't get past him, but it was still an utterly exciting finish. And I saw a Twitter post the other day where someone was talking about how the current NASCAR Cup cars handle because they have too much downforce, and they're not kind of sliding around like you expect a NASCAR Cup car to be doing. And the someone was showing footage of the spring race at a particular track and saying, look how great these cars used to drive. And then someone was saying, but you forget that the fall race was the most boring race ever. And I looked that up, and it was because someone had dominated that race. Well,
Yeah.
that's not boring. He just dominated the race, But in NASCAR, the way it was back then, that what that actually means is that as the weather changed during that event, he made the right decisions. He changed his setups in the right way. He dominated that race. They maybe even went there with the best car, but all of those aspects that had to come together for him to dominate that race, that's not boring.
Everybody talks about Donington 1993 as one of the best Formula One races ever, and yet Senna
Yeah, it was
lapped everybody up
dominated.
to third place, right?
Yeah,
And just because it was dry 1 minute, wet the next, and he managed those conditions better than anybody else did.
yeah,
But I mean, and that's the kind of management that you would actually put into a game like this. And so, I don't know. I comparatively in F1 Manager 22, I played as Toro Rosso, who were called AlphaTauri, of course. It's funny, they've had so many names now. I forget which one's which. Played as AlphaTauri, which is it's a weird team in itself because it doesn't have they have no aims to actually be at the top of the um, tables, um, and essentially, you are doing you're doing what don't really see on TV. What you don't see on TV is somebody pounding around to 11th place. If they're not in a battle with somebody, if there's no fight going on, you don't see it. And sometimes you do these races in this game where you're going, well, I've maximized the potential of my car and driver here, and we've come 11th, and that's it. And nothing happened. Like during the race, like I pounded round, and someone around me might have fallen off or something else. But basically, I wasn't as fast as the cars in front of me, and I was faster than the cars behind me, and so you just go along. And there are countless Formula One drivers whose entire careers have been about those sorts of races, time
yeah,
and time again.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think going back to your point, Tim, about like what's exciting and what isn't and stuff, and if, from a kind of management perspective, you might have a race where you start 11th and 12th and you finish 11th and 12th. You might not even overtake or be overtaken a single time in the race, but you might be completely on edge the whole way through, managing things or juggling things or making decisions that are what ensure that that is the result. And had you not made that, or if you made different decisions, you might have found yourself 15th and 16th or something.
Yeah.
So like it's not. I think the simple stat summary of a race aren't what tell you what was exciting or not. And just like if you're driving a sim, or in reality, you might be dicing with someone the whole race, battling to keep them behind you or battling trying to get past. Like you give it the Mansell Senna example. But the thing with I think we've talked about like what people want from games and stuff in different contexts before. There will be a lot of people who would take the experience you've described, John, of basically my car was good for 11th, that's where I came, and they're like, oh, I'm not winning, so this is boring or something. And I do wonder to what degree, what you're saying about like, you basically by your second season with Williams, you can be winning or something. It's like whether it's intentional, emergent, and they're kind of happy with that or whatever. It's like, do you think when you've got an official license, you've got to have a certain degree of mainstream appeal with this, no matter how kind of geeky or niche your product is?
You have to make
especially if it's F1, yeah.
Have they got to basically just build in the possibility for everyone to be a Superman and look at me, I'm the hero, I dragged this team up with my bootstraps, got them to the front.
Which is the same in the Codemasters F1 titles as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why you have to have a difficulty setting, and the Codemasters titles have a difficulty setting, and that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't get right is that. Like I have a system with like that I've used all the way back since the first racing games that had difficulty settings. I would make sure that I was able to comparatively run in the position that I wanted that car to run in. If it was a 15th place car, then I would adjust the entire rest of the field so I was placing 15th with my best laps. And the Cramond F1 game, for example. When the editor came out for that was actually on a cover disc first, is the first place that I got it, but I found out that the author of the editor actually never allowed them to do that, but they did it anyway. When that editor came out and I could make the other cars faster, that was just the best thing, because in his games every single car had the same handling, so it didn't matter which one you picked. Same speed and everything, when it was the player car. So that
you had to adjust all the other cars around you.
Yeah, you had to adjust them, and people don't think to do that now. They don't. They'll pick a car and they'll trust that Codemasters have balanced it for.
Which they have. They make it so that you can run up at the front in any car you got. Yeah. But it's an interesting point actually, though, because Grand Prix Manager 1 and 2, and I think Grand Prix World all had built-in editors so that you could do these sorts of things, which obviously led to huge modding communities around them that are existing to this day.
Yeah, and I actually think at least Grand Prix Manager 2 had a difficulty setting as well.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
And there was also scenarios that it would say, you're going in this situation with this. You're going to have a hard time here, and then there was another scenario thing like you're going into the best team or whatever, and a lot of the older managers had that option. It's like how hard do you want this to be? Okay, here's the teams that are within that bracket of difficulty.
But it's an interesting if you think about the context of say like a modern day management titles, the Frontier titles, for example, it is an interesting question of what does difficulty mean there? Because if you say, I want it to be challenging, well, you could argue, well, if you're talking real life, the challenge is go take Alpine, go take Williams, and see how far up you can get. If you're talking about in a title, well, if you make it an easy setting, you can understand, well, maybe, okay, that means you can go and take any team you want, and as long as you're not a complete idiot, your guys will somehow magically outperform them. But what does it mean to manage Red Bull on a hard difficulty? Mm-hmm. Does that suddenly mean your car is slow? Does it mean Verstappen can't drive? Because, I think
what they do is with these difficulty settings in Grand Prix Manager is that they make the AI that are controlling the other teams better or worse, right? So your
Hmm.
game is still the same, but the AI are better or worse at upgrading their car, sorting out their lives, and things like that, remembering to replace their spare parts and things like that.
Yeah, and
Those are the things that you do as a manager. And I think like these sorts of games always have a formula, right? That you work out over a certain amount of time eventually, anyway. And a lot of players work out. One of the reasons I think in the Frontier games people are winning with Williams in the second season is mostly because they've worked out the formula for the optimum way to upgrade your car and things like that. Um, Ultimately, I think the actual difficulty level is about how much money you've got in
mhm.
these games,
Yeah,
and that's kind of how it should be.
yeah, I, just going back to what you said right before that, it shouldn't be that difficult to undo, the formula though. Like if at the end of a season you've made certain improvements and the software then checks, okay, how fast is this car going to be? What is the difficulty setting? So let's scale the AI teams so that they're faster than whatever the player has got to. That's, it should be as simple as that. That they,
So dynamic difficulty, effectively.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's worked in racing games where there was this the unfortunate Kartcraft. It had this difficulty mode where basically it would take your sector times, as the speed for the fastest AI. So the faster that you went round, if you beat your own sector time, that's how the fastest cart then started lapping using your fastest sectors. And the faster that you got, the faster that the fastest cart got, and it honestly it was the best racing that I had for years and years and years before that was on Kartcraft, where it was doing that, and it was matching my skill levels as I improved as well. And it was just awesome. And I don't see why that can't be an element of every single racing title, management title, whatever, where if someone wants it that hard, give it to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think where it goes though with these sorts of games, management games on the whole, not just Formula One management games. Like it's the same with things like Stellaris. It's the same with a lot of like board games. Is that there is a formula to make this work well, and sometimes you find exploits. But essentially, once you've worked out how the numbers are working behind the scenes, realistically, you work out how to win at this game. And I think what makes these games more difficult to do that is that there are more and more numbers. And I think one of the things I find interesting about, well, not interesting about Frontiers games, kind of disappointing, is that I don't think they have that much strength and depth in these areas as older games like Grand Prix World did, for instance, or maybe Team F1, Ascaron's game, which I think was insanely hard, basically. But if you look at the depth of one of the key anecdotes for Grand Prix World that I've seen around the forums and stuff is that lots of people, for some reason, would start there with Williams in 1999, and they would say they come into the forums. They go, "I keep doing races and my rear wing keeps failing. It just keeps happening. Why is that?" And the answer to that is because the rigidity on the mechachrome engine that they're running is too high, and that creates a vibration which is causing your rear wing to fail in
Hmm.
every race. And you've got no way of knowing that within the game other than to work that out for yourself using logic, basically, to suss out why is my rear wing failing, and then to look at your engine stats, which say the rigidity is X, and then you can't actually change that as well because the Mechachrome engine is a customer engine. So unless you're a works engine partner, you can't make changes to the engine. So if you're a customer engine, your answer to that problem is to get a different customer engine for next season. So
That's
you're stuck with that problem the whole season,
that's so
whatever you
great.
do. Yeah, I think that is really cool. But it's actually really interesting how it's like an urban myth in the whole Grand Prix world because that game's been around for 25 years. It's an urban myth in the whole community because people keep popping up even still on the forums going, "I started with Williams and the rear wing keeps failing. What's going on?" The question gets asked time and time again. Well, fundamentally, I don't think those sorts of things happen in the Frontier games, and I
Hmm.
think that's because the complexity of the car modeling and the parts that you design for the car, the quality of the parts you design for the car, or anything like that, is not really modeled in much detail. You know, like you had options in the older games to, for instance, go, well, it's going to cost me well, no, I think we do have this actually. No, they have this in Frontier, don't they? The Frontier games where you can go um, build this part and it's going to take 2 weeks, but then go build this part and I need it in 3 days for the race, and then it puts certain risks on that part's reliability. So I think that does exist. I suppose I just haven't encountered having to do that as yet, because I guess if you have enough crash damage and things like that, you're going to run into that problem. But yeah, I mean, I feel like Grand Prix World definitely wins over these Frontier games in the on the management side.
Yeah.
I haven't played Team F1 enough. I feel like I'd like to get into that, but I need to find a manual because it's obscenely complicated. Reading the guy on Overtake talking about it, and he was like, the first race he like went, oh yeah, clicked on go to race, and the cars didn't show up at the track because he hadn't ticked the box to send them out
That's
to
great.
put them in and tick the box to put the cars in the post to Australia or whatever. And so and he still, like, the game still lets him he got to the race and he gets to watch the race without his cars in it or whatever. I mean, I think you can skip through, but basically, um, yeah, I think that one's pretty in depth in that respect, but also it's apparently obscenely hard, so it needs takes some working on.
I was going to bring up what about the racing experience in the current Frontier games? Because just talking about excitement, like we were earlier, the most exciting race that I remember having in the current game, I basically felt like I was driving the cars. And I'm not sure that should be something that I'm feeling because
You mean micromanaging
yeah,
performance?
yeah, like
Yeah.
it was a race where I was out of position because I had guessed the tire change correctly. And at that point, it made a much larger difference when you changed tire correctly in the game. They actually nerfed it, which was stupid.
You mean because rain had come
Yeah,
in, right? I think
yeah,
you've told me about this before. Wasn't that in F1 Manager 22 rather
yeah,
than 23?
yeah. 22
22,
was
yeah.
the first release.
I
Yeah.
think in 23 you have the micromanagement doesn't give you anywhere near the bonuses it used to in
Hmm.
22. That's something I think they fixed quite well. So
Okay.
like you're not there constantly doing, push on this corner, back off on this corner, and all that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
that was exactly it. Is that I basically had figured out how the AI worked for the race simulation. So basically, I knew that I could tell them to push out of a particular corner, and then they couldn't pass me on the straight. And
Yeah.
then the entire rest of the lap, they couldn't pass. So I would just tell them to back off. I think as soon as you can recognize those patterns with AI and you
Yeah.
can do something like that, it's a bit silly, but still the excitement came from that where I was almost driving the car, which actually gets me onto something that I posted about the other day called Formula Circus. I don't know if you guys saw that or not, but
No, not heard of it.
No.
yeah, there's these guys that are building in Unreal Engine. They just released a mod for F1 2020 because it's the last one that had physics that they could properly work with. So they just released a mod for F1 2020. Just let me see what years it is. Where you can go all the way from 1998 to 2007 as an actual career within F1 2020. And it has like certain tracks you can add to it and stuff like that for the schedule. And then as soon as they released that mod, they've now moved on to working on their own game full time, which is Formula Circus. where basically you get to be like a first person manager, of your career and stuff. Like they on their Twitter they have a video of them walking around the paddock model, and stuff like that. And then on their video, they, show you negotiating with like your personal sponsors and for a contract with a different team and stuff like that. So it just made me think, like, as we've been talking here, that that's obviously going to be a fully driven, you're going to be sat there with a steering wheel and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And adding an in-depth kind of, not an F1 manager depth thing, but at least a driver having to
Well,
negotiate his own things. It's that,
full-on career mode, basically, a proper
yeah,
career mode that realistically the devs of many games should already be doing.
yeah. It just kind of, I felt like it crossed over a little bit with what we were talking about
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And it's something that I wish a lot more games had, because with yearly releases, it's like, okay, well, I've played that year now. When's the next game coming out?
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. That's quite interesting. Well, what I was thinking is where what you're saying used to work quite well in F1 Manager 22, it doesn't work as well in 23. Like, you can do that to hold somebody off for a few laps or whatever, but you will.
Okay.
They've fixed it in a way you will essentially start to overheat your tires or whatnot. If you just keep doing that particular corner lap on lap, it will take a little time, and you'll be able to hold somebody off, and maybe if you're getting towards the end of the race, you might be able to hold them off long enough, but eventually you'll overheat your tires and they'll get by you. This brings me to think about online stuff. Now, I along with both of you have played IGP Manager for many years, actually. I played Bat Racer as well many years ago, but IGP Manager is the one I think we all probably have the most experience with, certainly Simon and I, because we ran in a league for, how long was it, Simon? 12 years?
Over 10 years, definitely, frighteningly. Yeah.
2011 it started. I left. I gave up on it this year, but you still doing it?
I'm still registered, but I've fizzled out on it completely.
Yeah. Now, one of the aspects of IGP Manager was very similar to, I think a lot of these online ones are the same, where they focus very much on the being a race engineering simulation. You're being a race manager rather than a team manager, and actually the team management aspects of it are kind of clicky,
Yep.
mobile game type. You've gone up a level, so you upgrade your facilities or whatever, and click this, click that. There isn't much difficulty involved in making money and things like that. And the actual focus is the races themselves. And I would say, Simon, I don't know if you'd agree, but like IGP Manager lent itself to this type of micromanagement of performance of the car, whereby on some circuits you would say, oh, well, I need to push through sector 2 and then back off in sector 3 and then push. And you get into a bit of a rhythm, lap on lap. And we used to do full length races, 70 odd laps, where you click plus here and then click minus there. And the excitement of it was that, we were friends doing this together, and the person that you were holding up, that, I was holding off Simon to try and win a race, or vice versa. And if that had been AI, that excitement is taken away quite a bit. How do you make that exciting in an AI world?
Well, one thing I will say, and I was thinking about exactly what you're talking about when Tim was talking about the race where you said you were basically felt like you were almost driving. Because one thing so I agree with your kind of sort of summary almost of the experience in IGP, John, where it can be very tense, especially when you get to you've been there for an hour and a half online together going through a race, and it's like, right, we're getting into the last 3 laps now, and it's like, when do you push your tires versus wait to have that final push and not overheat and stuff. But I do remember that someone else we used to play with, Kevin, I remember talking to him once, and he said, oh yeah, I've realized that basically, so the more you push, the more you heat the tires. which is sort of understandable logic, but it overheats them more on the straights than it does in the corners. So he used to literally be putting the push on full in a corner, then dropping it off on a straight, and literally doing it corner by
Every
corner.
corner.
And the thing, there's a couple of things with that. Is one, I just could not be asked to do that. I was like, look, I'm kind of concentrating, but I'm also having some beers, and I'm, talking about whatever program we'd been watching and whatever else on Discord and stuff. Like, I was sort of paying attention, but I'm not. But it also is like, this is not what I'm here for. I'm not here to be clicking a button every
Yeah.
corner for 17 corners for 70 laps or something. Like, that's not my idea of fun. And that's not about like duping the AI. That's kind of just game mechanics things. So, that did get to a point where I was like, you know what, I don't actually care if I can't beat Kevin, if I'm not willing to do this, because it's not my idea of fun. But to go back to your question, John, is what I would say, and it goes back almost to your initial observation of these modern titles about where the focus seems to be on the race, is that IGP Manager outside of the race is a pretty simplistic experience. You set your cars up for a race, which is basically a process of elimination to get you to the ideal setup, which is quite a simple thing. There's no real kind of gambling on your setup, like, oh, I'm going to gamble on a low downforce to be quicker on the straights, but not that you just go to a sweet spot and this is your best setup. There's no kind of tactics on that kind of thing. Your tactics is basically your strategy about when you refuel, if you have refueling selected, or when you have your tire changes and how often and stuff. So the focus then becomes the race, and yeah, as racing with real people, that adds an element that is really, really hard to replicate with AI. And I would almost see, so I haven't played these offline manager titles at all, but if I was going to have one, I think I would probably want one that goes the other way, where the detail is all the back end stuff, and a bit like you were describing, Tim, with the football manager titles. And I remember I used to live with a guy at uni who played football manager, and he was just on it for like, he'd literally be on it like 16 hours a day or something. But when you'd watch him play it, the actual games were just played out in a matter of a few minutes with little dots whizzing around. He wasn't
Yeah.
playing it for that. He was poring over the statistics and poring over all the detail and stuff. Because I don't think the racers can. I wouldn't want to sit, if I was going to sit through a race, I'd probably want to do it in real time almost, if I was going to do it properly, because I'm a bit all or nothing. But I also think, God, that's going to be really boring. I can't imagine recreating the time I put into IGP against AI. No way. It wouldn't appeal to me. So I think I would want, like, look, the race just runs out in a matter of minutes, almost just so you get the narrative of it, but almost not to be interacting with it. It's like, that's what my chief does, or my pit crew and whatever else. They do their thing, and I'm just, there to see how it plays out. And then to try and make the tweaks and stuff at the end. Because I don't think, as we said before, that the actual length of the races and the number of races, if you're just doing the races, you're talking like 50 hours just doing the races for a season. And then if you want to have a proper experience on top of that, of giving it appropriate amount of attention, that's without including like practices and qualifying stuff. If you then want to give it the appropriate thing on the kind of back end, well, you're not going to play more. You've been lucky if you did a season in a year, I think,
unless you've got nothing else to do, but like,
it
could be 100. It could be 100 hours to do a season, right? Let's say,
Yeah.
and it's a bit much. I mean, because you can do the practice. I tend to manually do the practice sessions, but I do them on accelerated time, so they bang past pretty quickly. But I tend to find that there are certain tricks that I do that if I just leave it to my race engineers to sort out, they don't do as good a job, right? So I'm still going to do those manually, even though they're probably taking 5 minutes because I'm just doing on accelerated time.
I just, I think for me, the thing that would get me interested with AI is just difficulty or challenge, I guess, not difficulty, because I think then I can feel like I've achieved something, and I'm, it's like if you've been, kind of finishing in 12th place for 90% of a season and then you're running in 10th place, you're going to get a point. It's like that's then a big deal to you. And I actually think it's related. Like I feel like I keep coming back to this, but I think it's related to difficulty and the challenge and stuff like that. That's how I would get interested with AI, and I do feel like that is all connected for me.
But what? Sorry, you go, Neil.
I think one of the problems with AI is what I was saying earlier, is that you can work out a formula for the game, and that's often about working out what the AI does. And that gives the game a certain amount of longevity that a multiplayer game is going to go well beyond, because you're playing against real human brains.
Yeah.
I mean, Grand Prix World is an exemplary of this. As I say, I did 4 or 5 seasons, and I was auto resolving the races. I didn't watch. I did a couple, and like there isn't much to do, and so it's just like, right, give up on that. But one thing I learned, and I know this is a total spoiler for a 25-year-old game, but is that the pit strategies of the AI almost always are very close together. And so lots of cars come into the pits on the same laps, and they have tremendous problems with unsafe releases and so on, right? Which, that doesn't mean they get penalties for unsafe releases, because it's not modern era. But it does mean that there are other cars that you might be racing against will lose seconds in the pits sometimes, because they've got to screech to a halt behind this car that's just pulled out in front of them, right? So as a simple trick to win at that game, you just need to make sure that your pit stop strategies are slightly off the basic norm that all the AI are going to do.
That's great.
And so if they're all going to pit on lap 24, you pit on lap 26, and you'll gain a load of time on them. And so once you've sussed that out, you're going, okay, well, the game's just got a whole lot easier because I've just worked that out, basically. And it's a flaw realistically in the game, but
Yeah, and a related anecdote I have from us playing IGP, and this is many years back, like in this is probably like 4th or 5th season. So just for the sake of anyone who's not played IGP, real tracks and stuff, but when it comes to kind of strategies and stuff, they could be a bit bonkers. Like, we used to run Monaco, and you do like 7 stops and stuff. The game's changed over the years.
Over the years. So the old super soft tires and 7 exactly. Stops era that we had was quite entertaining.
Yeah, just in terms, if you basically say what's the optimum strategy in terms of actual race time, you'd end up with some quite funky strategies. And what would invariably happen is that, over the first few years as we got used to the game and stuff, you'd go to a track you'd possibly never been there before, or we'd been there a few times, and then someone would do something, run a different strategy. Oh, that one's quicker, and everyone would swarm to that for the next season. And basically you'd converge around the optimum strategy. And then I remember one year though, we were doing it at Monaco, and Tero, a friend of ours who used to race in that league, he just went on a completely different strategy, and he pitted early, completely out of sync with what everyone else had done for the previous couple of seasons. And what that did was basically put him in clean air. So he ran without like either having to be defended or being tied up behind people and stuff. And so when everyone else got to their round of stops, he basically got the advantage, and he raced off easily to win that. And it's kind of almost, in a sense, a similar thing to what you're describing, John, but for very different reasons. That IGP didn't have anything about kind of pit stop congestion, certainly not at that point. But what it was actually about was you've got a load of people almost acting a bit robotically, and just without really thinking, we're all just like, right, what's the optimal thing? And then you've got someone who actually engages their brain and says, well, hang on.
Yeah.
Either I'd experiment and see, otherwise I'm just going to be stuck here in this train. Or, he had the foresight to say, well, actually, if I pit early, I'll get this clean air and get a leap on them. And then, so what you get in with real people that you typically aren't going to get with AI, unless it's kind of quite good AI, is actually looking at what everyone else is doing and saying, well, hang on, how can I respond to that to try and sort of like differentiate or get an advantage? because what you're describing is basically there's an AI follows a pattern, and if you learn
Yeah.
the formula, you can learn how to
Hmm.
game that and beat it. Whereas in reality, people are always going to change. And so when he did this the next season, obviously everyone had seen that and thought, well, hang on, if I just do the same thing, I don't get an advantage on him, but we fall into the same pattern. So then the
Yeah.
next season, it's all over the place because everyone's thinking, actually, if I stick with this, everyone else is going to do something different, and then I'll be left with the optimal,
Yeah,
And
you,
and
yeah,
everybody would then pit in
that's
response
so
to the
good.
early
and it
pitter, and
creates
then the person out the front has got
yeah,
clean air.
it
Yeah.
creates a lot of bluff. It's a lot of bluffing. It's a
Yeah.
lot of
It's
kind of
like
game
real,
theory,
yeah,
but
very
it but
real.
it's not in a static environment. It's
No.
not. Well, the AI is going to do that, and I know that. And once I figured it out, I can work out if I do this or if I do that, I'm past them. Because you'll never know. And the number of times where you like, we had these races, and you like pit, and you think one lap goes by, 2 laps go by, 3 laps go by. It's like no one else is pitting. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
hang
Yeah.
on, I was pretty sure my tires were kind of going over the cliff there. So, like, and you're like, have I made a great decision here? Have I made a terrible decision? And then you have your first couple of laps and you're like, oh, yeah, I'm eating into them. And it's like, once you lose your new tire advantage, you're like, oh, shit, they're going the same speed as me, but they're doing one stop less this race and things. And that kind of thing was like really, as we've said, we played that for what 12 years or something. There were a few times in that where we were like, why are we doing this? And like, are we really going to
Yeah.
keep doing this? But when every Wednesday night, give or take, for over a decade of our life, we sat there for an hour and a half and watched little dots going around on a screen. And
And
yeah,
there were a lot of races where we were sitting there with 15, 20 minutes to go, going, we don't know how this is going to turn
yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah. And am I going to run out of fuel? I
But I
don't
mean,
understand. I can't
it,
tell where I am compared to you because are you pitting again or not
yeah,
and
yeah.
stuff.
But it's still F1, so there was still also a lot of races where we were there going, Will Simon's won this by a mile, or
Mm.
or I've won it by, or, like the best races were the ones that I won by a mile, obviously. But
You,
and that's a
you
funny
know,
thing actually, because I do remember thinking to myself as well, because as you said earlier, Simon, the stress and sort of like getting your heart racing aspect that you would get normally from a sim where you're driving,
Yeah.
like where I didn't never I've never got that as much with racing against AI in management sims. But with IGP, we're essentially on Discord to each other and whatever, and we see it's getting close, and we're all like, "Oh, you bastard," or whatever, and like at the same time, your heart's beating, you're genuinely excited, but also pretty. It's quite sort of stressful to see, am I going
Mm.
to be able to hold on to it? My favourite races were the ones that were an easy 1, 2, a mile ahead, and were maybe much more boring. It was a lot more boring when you were getting an
Mm.
easy 1, 2 miles ahead, but it wasn't boring if I was getting a 1, 2 because those are the best races possible and low stress.
Well, if you're the one who does, if you're out front 1-2 and you realise, I've got to stop on everyone else and stuff, it's incredibly satisfying. And you think, you know what? Yeah, maybe there's an element of luck in it, but ultimately I made the decisions and I made the right decisions and I did
yeah,
it better than everyone else. There's a sense of
Yeah,
satisfaction. It's not roll or dice. It's not like random number generators determining what's happening. It's pretty deterministic. You've decided what to do and you've made the right decisions. And likewise, someone else can do it, and you can realize pretty early on, like, oh, this is going to be a pretty dull hour and 15 minutes to go, or a bit futile. But also, you just always think, well, fair play. They made a far better job of this than I did. But likewise, you can then have the ones where it comes down to the wire and you might end up getting pipped literally out of the last corner because someone's saved a bit more curves than you've got left, or you realised you know, knackered your tyres pushing that bit earlier on, trying to get past or keep someone behind and stuff. And I think what IGP Manager was a really good example of, and I think it's true to say this, albeit it's not kind of, it's against real people, not AI, but there's a lot of emergent stuff. A lot of things, you've got a fairly simple set of rules and parameters, all things being equal. But you put people in there and say, right, you make your choices, you go at it. And, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you see a right variety of strategies. You've got people starting on 3 different compounds of tyres, and not you're sat there on the grid thinking, I'm the only one starting on
Yeah.
mediums.
Have I made the right
Have I
choice?
made the right choice? I made a terrible decision. And sometimes you very quickly and painfully realize, yeah, I've really balls this one up. Sometimes you're like, oh wow,
They've really ballsed it
I'm in for a good evening
up.
here. And quite often I've no idea, and I'm going to have to wait quite a long time to see how this kind of all plays out. And you can have that with a kind of AI process, but I think it's really challenging, especially when you're trying to balance a load of things and everything else. With humans, it kind of auto balances because whatever you do, in theory, someone else can do. They could make the same decisions you've made and have the same outcomes you're having. If you're talking about against AI and you've got different teams and different cars and you're trying to make it so anyone can, in theory, win and all this and all that, I don't know
Well,
if you get stuck with that thing where you can understand the formula, reverse engineer it, and make the optimal decisions and basically be unbeatable.
but the initial part with the AI, where you are first playing the game and probably for the first maybe even whole season, let's say, when you're still working out the AI, that's where you still have these
Yeah.
excitements and you still come into a race and go, have I made the right tire choice here and things like that. But unlike the multiplayer human element, yeah, and I think this does erode in the human element. I'll come back to that, but like in with the AI, after you got, if you've done, let's say, 100 races, you're going to know what the AI are going to do in nearly every
Hmm.
race, nearly every scenario. You're not necessarily with people, but as you sort of mentioned earlier, Simon, with IGP, we would often start to converge on strategies. And we'd go through season after season, oh, look, we're at Belgium again and we're all doing this strategy. And we'll see how it turns out. It generally come down to how Kerr's usage or who got DRS at the right time and things like that. But like,
Qualifying.
yeah, all qualifying. But like, basically, what would upset that then is if IGP managed to release an update and they changed the tyres a little bit and then suddenly we all had to rethink our how our strategies work for the next season. And so that kept the game interesting because if they'd never modified
Mm.
tire performance in that sense and tire wear rates, then it would have just we would never have carried on for 10, 12 years because we would have got it in 2 or 3 years. We'd have just gone, well, we're just doing season after season of the same races over and over because we've all worked out that doing a 3 stop on this race is the best way and full stop.
Yeah.
That that actually leads into something I was going to bring up, which is car setup. Because quite often in these management games, if you find a good setup, your first season or whatever, you can reuse it second season, third season, fourth,
Yeah.
and even though you've redesigned a completely new car, same setup, same setup, same
Same
setup,
setup on that
Yeah.
car.
and that annoys me.
Oh, I mean, it's another aspect though that the team principal would not get involved in really at
Yeah,
all, right?
true.
And I one thing I'm sort of what I get annoyed by with car setup in the Frontier games and some of the older games is that I have to really do any of it. Like I'm not really. I should be able to like the. My job as team principal is to hire high quality engineers, and that is a modifier that should contribute to how good the car setup is on the cars.
Yeah.
And so if the driver feedback is my setup was crap, then I need to hire better engineers, and that should be the gameplay loop that takes place there. I think I don't think I should be individually responsible for setting the camber on Max Verstappen's car,
or
right?
or at least an option not to. If
Yeah,
it's actually pretty crazy that that's how they are. That the setup basically, as long as you note it down, or in the older sims you could save the actual setup.
yeah.
But if you note it down in the current Frontier game, when you've got a good setup, and then you go to the next year, you can run it again and again and again.
It's the same with IGP Manager. If it's dry, If it's dry, the setup will be the same. If it's wet, I think it's even the same. Wet
Yeah.
on, year on year. It's just different
regardless of how
between wet
you
and dry.
regardless of how you've developed your car
Yeah,
as well.
exactly.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
one year you can say, I'm going to put all my focus on aero development. The next year it might be, oh no, I'm going to put it all into kind of like, engine and tires or
Yeah.
something. And yeah, it's to say it changed. There were things that changed the setup, so your driver has an impact on that
Yeah.
and stuff. But what's quite, I mean, again, for those who've never played it, the way it works in setting up your car is you basically got three parameters. So you have like soft, medium, or hard for suspension. You have
Yeah.
ride height and you've got wing level from a
Just
scale of
two
like
things.
0 to 50. And then what you do is you've got 5 runs per driver. You run them and they'll come back and go, oh, this is a bit high. That's a bit low. And so
Yeah.
you're like, right, well, I'll bump it up by 10. Oh, it's still too low. I'll bump it up by, and like when you actually do it, so maybe the first 2 or 3 times you do this, it's like, oh, this is interesting. It's something new.
Hmm.
You very quickly, and then it really very quickly becomes like, this is not at all challenging. It's just a
Yeah.
pretty tedious, like by the numbers thing, and then you get the optimal setup. And then, yeah, if you've got the forethought to just open up a spreadsheet and make a note of these, you can just copy and paste it year on year, and you might
Yeah.
need to change it 1 or 2 if something else has changed in your driver's changed or something. But by and large, you don't change it. But also, you can use tokens to buy the optimal setup, tokens which you win by getting races, or you can stick real money into the thing. And there were a number of times where I was maybe like, oh, it's a new circuit. Oh, I'll just spend 3 token, not real money, but I'll just say, right, I'm spending the tokens because I cannot be bothered to do this
With the
tedious
tedious mini
hoop
game.
jumping. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
mini game. Perfect description.
Yeah.
And that's the point where it's like fulfilling that, finding that optimal setup is not remotely intellectually challenging.
Hmm.
There's no decision making there. Like you can't say, oh, I'm going to, it's, I mean, if I asked my kids to try and do this, they wouldn't get close because kids are idiots, but if you've got a brain, you're like, right, well, I'll start at a midpoint, I know this is like, this is Monza, so it's going to be relatively low downforce. This is Monaco, it's going to be relatively high downforce, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, it's not like, right, you make some sort of trade-off and it's a bit of a gamble and you kind of err towards something and then you end up with something that's invariably going to have some compromise and some risk in it. So you might have a setup that is great for the straights, but you're really risking giving away time on the corners. It's just not like that. It's like, what is the optimal setup? It's this. It's not hard to get to.
Yeah.
And so it's just a tick box exercise. It's like, and that's what.
But once they are available as well, like, in F1 Manager 23, there are guides that I've found where you can get the optimum setups for your cars, and that's it. So as soon as I got that, I just used that because I'm like, well, I don't want to play the tedious minigame. But one of the key aspects of F1 Manager 23 over 22 was they introduced this concept of a relation, like you've got driver confidence is a new thing, and that varies like all the time during the race and throughout practice and qualifying and stuff. And it's a big aspect of the driver's performance. But you've also got a relationship between your driver and race engineer, which can change race on race based on good or bad decisions and things like this. Now, I feel like if they're modeling all these statistics, the setup really should be a product of your driver's skill stats, your race engineer's skill stats,
Yeah, it should be
the
taken into
relationship
account.
between them, and the stats of your back-end engineers as well. And maybe the stats in relation to your facilities as well, the facilities that you have that for those simulations or whatever. But I don't understand why I have to do it fundamentally. One thing I was going to mention is I once played a management game for baseball called Out of the Park Baseball, which has a yearly release and is very well appreciated by baseball fans. And in that game, when you start a new campaign, it actually says to you, what do you want to manage? because basically you hire coaches and whatever, and you hire talent scouts to go off and hire find new talent. And you can opt to do all of that stuff yourself, or you can opt to say, no, I'm just the manager and I make the decisions. So you can override, you can be in a position where you can say, no, I want this player to bunt this pitch. Or you can just leave the coaches to sort all of that out during the matches and indeed not even turn up to the matches yourself. And I think there's probably an element that could be introduced from that perspective for the Frontier games. I don't know if they will do it. I get a feeling that because they have this yearly release cycle, they have limited time for introducing new features, and so
Yeah.
each year is an iterative upgrade on the last. And I do think 23 is better than 22, but it's not a chasm leap. And I imagine that 24 will be better than 23 as well, but also not a chasm leap.
Do
Right, another
you?
game I would. Oh,
I
go on, sorry.
I just wanted to bring up before we move on from like Frontier there. Do you think it would add a lot if because they have what I think is a 4-year license? If at the end they do an F1 Challenge 9902 and are like
Do
and
the whole lot.
yeah, and actually allow you to play through season on season and reset the performance of the cars at the start of each season to kind of to try to get it where it was, in kind of real life, so that you can kind of play along. Do you think that would add something?
I mean, yes, but I don't think the license would allow them to do that. I think the best thing that they could do when the license expires is utilize the assets to create a different non-licensed motorsport management game that
Moddable.
has modding capabilities,
Yeah,
so that people can put F1 stuff or other stuff into it.
yeah,
Which
true.
perfectly segues me into the game I want to talk about next,
There we
which is
go.
Open Wheel Manager, or Open Wheel Manager 2 specifically. Recently, um, they released modding tools for this. Open Wheel Manager 2 is what you could call a spiritual successor to Grand Prix World. So it puts a lot more focus into the management side of things rather than the races. It's based around Grand Prix Formula One of the 1996 era, though it's unlicensed, and so it's sort of like Ferrari are called Foggy or whatever, I can't remember, but like McClunker and all that sort of thing. But you can see what team is what, and obviously since the modding tools have been released, there's been a few seasons. So I've been playing the 1999 season mod, which is pretty solid so far. There's a bit more work to do with the modding tools at the moment, like the sponsor logos are not in there yet and things like that. So it's still using all the old unlicensed sponsor names. But it like Grand Prix World. It doesn't try to be overly realism focused. It doesn't try to not be a game. It is a game, and so things work on resources essentially. So like how can I? For example, if you use the wind tunnel for research, you might generate a certain amount of engineering resource, which can then be used in upgrading components on the car and things like that. And so you might research a new part, and it will say, well, to manufacture this part, you need X amount of mechanics resource, spanner resource to actually build this part. And so as every week passes, you renew a certain amount of resources based on your facilities. And I think this is similar to the structure in Grand Prix World. And what this means is sort of like a turn based strategy game whereby each week is a turn. So you usually quite often have 2 weeks in between races. And you can do a certain amount of things based on how much resource you're able to present to yourself within each week. Um, and it's very clever and it's very well done actually, and quite enjoyable. The races again can be more or less skipped and simulated in the background. I've done a few. They don't run in full real time, so the races still. I think they take about 45 minutes to run through. But as some people have mentioned in their forums, like it's sort of 1990s Formula One, so it's not necessarily, there's no DRS. Sometimes overtaking is very difficult and things like that. And I've seen some people sort of complaining, oh, sometimes I sit behind a car for ages, and it's like, well, that's just how it was in that
Yeah.
era. And that maybe you need to configure your car differently, qualify better, get better drivers, etc., etc. But I think it's a really strong game, and actually, sort of fulfills what we're talking about there with what Frontier I doubt will get away with doing, which is that it gives you a game framework that works very well, and then presents modding tools to the community to be able to create all whatever season they want. I mean, I think somebody's doing like the 1980 season and stuff like that. These are
Yeah.
I can't account for the quality necessarily or how well, what I tend to find with user made mods like this is that people's beliefs, you know, suddenly Ralph Schumacher's a lot faster than he really was, and things like
Right.
that, because it turns out he was their favourite or whatever. But you obviously, with the editor available, you can change those things yourself anyway. So yeah, I think that's a really cool game, and it doesn't have the track layouts are not real, but it's made in Unity, which again makes me think that in the longer term, modders will be able to
Yeah.
put in the real tracks, and it's a 3D viewer as well, so it doesn't look quite as shiny as Frontier's games by any means, but it's certainly quite watchable, should you say? But I really think the focus of that game is on the management side, and I think it's definitely worth a play.
Well, I think what you've really, really, really highlighted there is modding, and although I think I spent most time on Grand Prix Manager 2, Grand Prix World is still so strong, and has mods for every single thing that you can think of, and yeah, modding is so huge, and it's although Frontier are bringing it in with the 24 edition, where you can have your own 11th team and stuff like that, it's still not what it needs to be. Where you can insert another 10 teams that you want to actually race against, or it starts like just stuff like that, or you can take a sponsor away from them, like you were saying earlier. It kind of, yeah, modding is really huge for this type of game, and not having it is probably one of the biggest issues that the current
Yeah,
games have.
definitely. The thing about the sponsor thing like that is one of the things people have been talking about recently with Adrian Newey announcing his departure,
Yeah.
is that you not only do you, by pulling that sponsor from another team, not only do you strengthen your team, but you directly weaken a
Hmm.
competitor at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, and I think without having that aspect in it, it's very little. I mean, I guess like in F1 Manager, you can steal drivers from other teams, and engineers. You can steal your Adrian Newey and whatnot. I don't know really how much impact that necessarily has. I don't know if putting Newey into your Williams is going to speed up too much of it. It should, obviously. But yeah, I mean, that's a real strategic aspect of Formula One in a way, isn't it? Is that, like, you know, whoever hires Adrian Newey now, presuming he doesn't retire, is not just getting a win for themselves, but they're hurting Red Bull. And from Red Bull's perspective, to not have him means that he's against them, basically. So, um, and that's a big strategic element of all these management games.
I
Yeah.
do one of the things when you're talking about F1 Manager 2, and you described it as, I think you basically said it's a game rather than a simulation or something to that
But
effect.
just that it's not 100% focused on trying to be a realistic
Yeah,
thing.
and I think there's different ways you can approach creating a game like this, and I think for a title like this, that's probably an approach that I would advocate taking. Because first of all, if you actually tried to make a genuinely realistic F1 management title, for example, and as we've kind of touched on this in early conversation, it's probably going to be pretty boring. Or you think how many people are employed in an F1 team. You're either going to be Christian Horner simulator, in which case you're not deciding this, you're not deciding that, you've got nothing to do with this, you've got nothing to do with that. And actually, what you're doing in half of it's TV appearances and talking to people and meetings and stuff. And that's not a game that you would either could play or would want to play. And so then it becomes this weird kind of mismatch of like you're sort of this very kind of overbearing, micromanaging figure that sort of doesn't really exist in reality, but also couldn't really function in reality.
Yeah.
And I think the alternative is you can look at things, you can go down a slightly kind of goofy route and think about your kind of theme parks and theme hospitals and stuff and think, well, how do you take that kind of very much game mechanic approach and apply it in a kind of motorsport context? Or you maybe go down something slightly more, Sim City, City Skyline or whatever type thing, which is, I guess, whether you're talking about being a mayor or whatever, but again, not really, because a mayor doesn't typically design the road network and stuff. But the point is,
plumbing.
You can basically make it a kind of quite cartoony or quite serious and dry sort of strategy game. But it doesn't. I think chasing realism in some respects is a kind of you're on a hide into nothing, because if you actually achieved realism, it wouldn't be a very good title. So I think having something as you're describing, as I understand Open World Manager 2 to be, where it's, like you say, it's a framework, you can let people kind of make what either they've got a passion for or what they can hear people are clamoring for in terms of the content and everything else. And I kind of going back to IGP Manager in a way, you actually need, in some respects, a relatively few number of basics in place and working properly to let people have a good experience. And I'm guessing this is sort of AI based rather than multiplayer. But still, I think, I think you just need to drop the idea of trying to recreate some things, and license constraints are obviously going to be something that make that more difficult if you're talking about making a modern F1 title with all the kind of trappings of the licensing side on that. And I think, you want to start from a game and you think about what are the mechanics that are actually going to make an interesting title here, and then it's not going to be a simulator, but it's going to be an experience that is entertaining and rewarding, challenging, etc., etc. I know we're kind of very much sim focused typically in our conversations, but
Well, I mean, I think a balance really needs to be struck. Like these some of the sort of German-made games in the mid '90s, F1 Manager Pro and Team F1 seemed to really go granular on the being super realistic. And I gave the example earlier in Team F1 where the guy on Overtake was playing it and failed to actually deliver his cars to the racetrack and stuff like that. And like there is a balance to be struck with that. And I think I'm certainly interested in playing that game to really get to really understand how in depth it goes with that sort of realism aspect. Because one point you just mentioned as well, Simon, I think that it seems to be pretty absent from a lot of these games, is that one of the biggest aspects of a team principal's job is communication with the press. And that communication with the press affects the reputation of the team. It affects how the team are viewed, like like fan support and things like that. And these aspects, which in turn feed into team morale, right? So I know in Grand Prix World there's an overall modifier for team morale, and when your morale is like in the 100%, in fact, I think the highest it goes to 125%, and that's when you've been getting multiple 1-2s, when that makes the team even stronger because they're just winning and winning and winning, and they their morale is way up high. And if you're a smaller team fighting to get attention, there's an aspect of GP World which is about merchandising, right? And seems mostly quite useless in the game. It's nice that it's included, but you don't really need to do it to really achieve very much. And mostly what it's about is building a fan base and building a fan club, and you have a number of your fans. But I don't think it has much impact on your team morale, for instance. Whereas in reality, that would have more of an impact. And if you're sticky situation here. Not, I shouldn't have said that. Well, if your team principal is, let's say, doing things they shouldn't be doing, it might, in fact,
Got it.
or saying things to the press. So if you've got I don't know, multiple choice answers or whatever, it doesn't have to be hugely complex, but basically can affect their reputation or impact on the team as a whole. You know, if the team principal is saying things bad about the team, and the team, or maybe even an individual within the team, that specific race engineer might get, pissed off with you or whatever. And these are aspects of these types of games I don't think have been explored at all.
It's a huge
And
amount
it's
of
actually
politics.
it's actually one of the main tasks of a team principal is this politicking and sort of diplomacy that you typically see more in games like Civilization and stuff like that.
When I was saying before about, like SimCity or whatever else, when I was sort of formulating the idea in my head, I was kind of thinking that in a way, if you really wanted to make a realistic game of, say, being, a team principal, you're probably going to end up with something that's more like Civilization than you are than actually what current management titles look like. It's going to be a huge amount of menus with various facets and things to consider, and it's basically going to be a balancing act. And you're going to appease these people at the expense of putting these people's noses out of joint. You're maybe going to have some scandal in your team, and how it gets handled might lead to your chief designer saying, right, I'm leaving. Stranger things have happened in real life, but there are also things that they're quite difficult to recreate in a certain type of game environment. And like I say, that's why I think it almost pushes you towards, like I say, a Civilization type title, rather than trying to do it in a kind of glossy, EA type experience or something. I think it needs to be a much more strategic one.
Open Wheel Manager in a way reminded me of Stellaris in some of its the way it's structured in a way. Not that you're in space or anything like that, but just the resource management and pulling things together. It doesn't make you do the setup. It does, for instance, make that a product of the staff you have and the skills you have. But there's also some randomization in there as well, in the sense that maybe the team running this car didn't quite get things together this weekend and things like that.
Yeah, football managers have been really good with the press simulation for a really, really, really long time, with the multiple choice stuff. And it's a shame that hasn't come across, because it's a massive part of, that's a massive part of the rivalry too. I think, most of the Mercedes and Red Bull stuff is because of their team managers, kind of going back and forth.
And in the past, Frank Williams and Ron Dennis always had a few things to say to each other.
Yeah, it's a shame that that's not really a part of
any of these games. Yeah. Okay, so the final question really is, why are all these games about Formula One, and why are there so few management sims of any other motorsport? Now, I've noticed coming out quite soon, there is a game called GT Manager, which I believe is a development on their mobile game, but it has they have license for WEC properties, i.e. cars, drivers and teams, but I don't think they have any circuits, so the tracks are made up tracks.
Yeah, but
tracks, other than that's shaping up to be quite an interesting little game. Yeah,
the tracks are very obviously based off the season, but they don't have the proper licensing, it looks like. But they have hypercars and all that stuff, so
Motorsport Manager also had an endurance add-on. I think it's interesting to me, because I think with sports cars and endurance racing, you've got a whole lot more strategic options going on, and driver management and stuff like that. Certainly within the race simulation part, and I'm getting the impression GT Manager looks like it's probably more race focused than management focused.
There were the Sega titles, weren't they, that had multiple genres in?
Sega.
Weren't there some titles you played a couple of years back, John? I'm sure there were Sega ones, weren't they?
Oh, that's Motorsport Manager.
Right. Yeah.
That I was just talking about. So that has a DLC that's the sound of rapid googling happening there.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
that
it.
has an endurance add-on for it. Basically, nothing's licensed in Motorsport Manager, but it's a pretty good game, I think.
I do think the what we're seeing there is it's just a percentage and a numbers game. It's like, management games are less popular
Yeah.
than general racing games, and in general racing games, you have more F1 and you have a tiny section of every other category. And I think you're going to see the same thing in management games. And that's why there's so few management games, and they are all F1. Is because it's probably the same percentage of game.
Well, if I look, for instance, on the genre on Moby games of motorsport management games, since 1983, there's a total of 30 games, which is not very many. And nearly all of them are Formula One. There's a couple that are MotoGP or 500cc. There's a banger racing manager. That sounds quite interesting for Commodore 64. But certainly anything more recent is mostly F1 or Motorsport Manager is sort of F3, F2, F1, and endurance. It does a number of things. What's one thing that strikes me is that there doesn't seem to be a NASCAR management game ever. And yet NASCAR's got to be the second biggest motorsport in the world.
There's one being developed right now, and there was
Oh,
one that was in progress and was cancelled that Papyrus were making back in the late 90s.
okay.
But yeah,
I think you're right though, Tim, in terms of the numbers, because I mean you can going back to the examples I gave of like theme park and theme hospital and stuff. It's not like there's all these people out there who are big hospital fans wanting to manage a hospital. Like that was obviously a kind of creative and fun title.
It's
But
about
actually,
making a good game, yeah.
what you're seeing in the motorsport games is much, in general, perhaps the banger racing one might be a bit different. They're much more serious, and consequently, they're much more niche. And then if you're gonna create a motorsport management title, there might have been periods, you can imagine in the 90s in the UK, a touring car title might have been particularly well received, but that's not
yeah,
great for a global level. In their heyday, IndyCar and stuff in the past has had obviously it's like peaks in popularity. NASCAR, as you say, John, is perhaps the obvious kind of missing example now. But if you're putting your time and resources into that, whether it's licensed or not, it would be a hard decision, I think, to go against doing F1 or at least including F1 because it's the
yeah.
way that you're just going to appeal to the most people just by
You,
virtue of the fact it's
Well,
the most
you
yeah.
popular title.
you've obviously not played Grand Prix Story on your Nintendo Switch, so that's actually a very cute and actually quite good Grand Prix management or motorsport management game that's worth having a look at, frankly. But it's certainly not
Here it
taking
goes,
itself
Googling.
too seriously. Yeah, the
I'm
Google.
I'm I'm going to shock you and say that no, I haven't
No,
played
no,
that one.
okay, yeah. Oh, you should pick it up, Simon, and we'll hear about it next time. The point with NASCAR with me is I think that could be popular. Again, it's about making a good game, and I agree. Different forms of motorsport aren't as they're not as well looked at, I guess, and you're going to get less casual players and things like that if they don't understand it. The difference with Theme Hospital is that everybody knows what a hospital is,
Mm.
and if you say NASCAR manager, then you're mostly attracting NASCAR fans, and NASCAR doesn't necessarily have the global reach, so it's not necessarily going to find Formula One fans going to play it and stuff like that. And similarly, if you did something like WEC, you're not going to get that many Formula One fans in it because I mean, I went to a WC event in Imola a couple of weeks ago, and I talked to people at work. People are like, "Oh, what did you do while you were away in Italy?" And I tell them, and none of them have ever heard of WEC. They've all
Yeah.
heard of Formula One, and they're, oh, I've heard of Imola from Formula One, but I've never heard of this other sports car thing. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's only been going for like 80 years or more.
You fool.
What do you think about rallying, Simon? World Rally, WRC management.
It's an interesting one because in some ways you know you there's very little management of a car in a stage. So going back to the kind of what's the balance of the kind of race versus the back end, if you were to do a
Mm.
rally one, there would basically be nothing during the stage itself. They do
Well, I
have
mean, they
guys
they
out.
they they will radio through things like, oh well, your main competitors stuffed it in the bin, so you need to back off now. You don't need to risk anything, right?
Yeah, but it's very little, and they're
Yeah,
not on there like minute by minute doing stuff. There's very little
no.
car to team communication, certainly in stage. So
But
then
there's the
that,
management of the damage control in service and things like
yeah,
that, which are
exactly.
usually part of most management WRC sims as
Yeah, well, I
well.
mean that's the
I
thing.
think you could extend on that for a management game.
Yeah, on a kind of on an event basis,
Yeah,
there are things to do like you say, it's kind of right, we've got this much time and there's this and this need doing, just like you used to have in titles like Richard Burns, Colin McRae and stuff. It's
and
like,
the cars are prototypes, so they're developing a new car every year. You've got the
yeah.
developing next season's car and stuff like that coming
Well, that's
in.
the thing. Sorry, so I was trying to split the two things out. There's almost like on a rally base, like on a given event, what are you actually possibly doing there? And then yeah, there's the whole back end stuff. The whole back end stuff, in some respects, not any different necessarily, really, than any other series. Like it's got its nuances and it's got its differences in a way, but it's the same thing of you're talking budgets, you're talking staff, you're talking development, you're talking sponsorship if you want, and so on and so forth. So I mean, I think in that sense it could be a good fit. Commercially, is that a title that's going to get people in? I would think you're looking at a somewhat niche thing, but
Maybe,
then why can't that be something that gets released on Steam and sells a few thousand units if the right person is motivated to do it? There's
yeah.
lots of things that don't necessarily sell a huge amount. I don't think you're going to see it on the shelf in your local shop anytime soon. But
I don't know how much the WRC games actually sell really, because rallying is quite niche, but it's generally seen as jolly entertaining to drive,
mm,
right? And I think it's also jolly entertaining to watch in that sense. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think there is a potential for all of these places things, but as you say, it has to be whoever's developing it has to have the right expectations for how much it's going to sell.
I mean, I think one advantage, say, rallying might have there, going back a few minutes in the conversation, is if you had a title called WEC Manager, no one's going to know what that is. And I think there's a reason like Le Mans Ultimate is called Le Mans Ultimate and not
Yeah, yeah,
WEC Ultimate, for
Yeah.
example. If you had a title on the shelf that's called, Racing Manager, people might figure out what it is. And likewise, you could have Rally Manager.
yeah.
A lot of people understand what rallying is, even if they know very little about it. Whether that's going to entice them to actually pick up the box or never mind put their money down, who knows? But at least actually as a word, people understand what it means. IMSA manager, I think you're gonna,
Yeah, yeah.
there's not many people gonna like, ooh, sounds
Certainly
interesting.
outside of the US, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Even in the US, that's a niche. But I mean, yeah. I mean, WRC would be the biggest one, but you could have regional series. You could have.
Or just completely unlicensed, then even like, whatever your
It
options.
seems like something you would need to do completely unlicensed because whatever you're paying for the license probably isn't going to offset what you will make back in sales. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a vision in my head of someone picking up a rally manager box and thinking, oh, I can manage like political rallies and things. And
Yeah. I just had a vision in my head of the idea that you go to a shop and pick up a video
yeah,
game box at
that's
all.
yeah, long
Those were
time
the
ago.
days, Simon. Thanks for that little blast from the past.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we've covered the subject in quite some detail now. So I think that's about all from us. Unless anybody else had anything they wanted to bring up.
I just want to mention that I went through a lot of pain to get, let's see which ones there are. There's F1 Manager 96, F1 Manager Professional, Grand Prix Manager 2, and let's see, what's the other one?
Team F1, you've got up there.
Team F1 are all playable on the website. Yeah, you can go and play those in your browser. Lock the mouse to the little game window and try to play these games just
Defeat the
like we
world.
used to.
I should maybe mention that F1. If you're playing F1 Manager, you might as well be playing F1 Manager Pro. To be fair, so
I await the day, Tim, that you become Sir Tim Wheatley for MBE for services to
To sim racing,
Preservation.
yeah.
simulation preservation.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I
often
mean,
often overlooked amongst the charity work and everything else that gets done.
yeah, there's actually a website as well, Grand Prix Manager World,
Yeah.
where there are a huge amount of mods for Grand Prix Manager, Grand Prix Manager 2, and Grand Prix World, giving you just about any season you can imagine. Um, I don't know whether you'd be able to. You probably wouldn't be able to put those on the web versions, would you? But you
I
can buy essentially from those sites download complete working installers. Certainly for Grand Prix World,
yeah.
you download the season pack and it just works on Windows 10 anyway. I don't think it works on Windows 11.
Yeah, that's the shame. That's a shame with you know, kind of how gaming seems to be right now. But a lot of really good racing sims, management sims, stuff like that are still out there. You know,
Yeah,
you can still go and you can still run them, and you know, people seem to chase kind of the cutting edge stuff, and you know, you can still find so much enjoyment from a lot of these old games, and people should be going and playing them.
well, that said, actually, Tim, I've been on a few Discords recently, what with this subject, and I think I've seen people via the Frontier F1 Manager Discord finding some of these older games
Oh, that's
and
brilliant. Okay.
appearing in like the Grand Prix Manager Discord. The same people I see seeing them appear, and they're like, "Oh, I've got into playing this now," and you know, I think
That's great.
there is it's not. I'm not talking thousands of people or anything, but like you know, there are people that are digging around these titles, especially with the
Great.
interest that F1 has going on at the moment.
That's awesome.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Bye bye.